The quotes and texts that we're actually going to be studying come from what is called the Pali Canon. This is the central Buddhist texts which give the foundation for what's called Theravadan Buddhism. They are the most ancient texts we have from Buddhism. There are others that were revealed in Sanskrit, and some that we have in Tibetan and Chinese, which come from the Mahayana tradition. This is a quick synopsis, whereas this is in the Pali language and is generally seen to be some of the most ancient authoritative texts of Buddhism. And one of the things that's going to come up a lot for some readers or some viewers is how different this perspective of Buddhism might be from what they've heard or been told by friends, colleagues, and in general media within the West. Because oftentimes I believe we see a Buddhism that has been culled, meaning parts of it have actually been chopped off in its presentation to Western audiences. So we often hear that Buddhism is a mere philosophical system. It's not a religion, or it's a system of meditation, even to the point where some people say that a person can be Buddhist and Christian, that because it's actually not religious itself, it's more of a practice or a philosophical system, they can actually blend. Another aspect that we often see is many of the rules and regulations and moral precepts and ritualistic precepts of Buddhism also get removed. So, for example, the Vinaya, which is actually the rules and codes of conduct for monks and nuns of Buddhism. We often also have presented to us a Buddhism that is devoid of judgment. No conceptions of heaven, no conceptions of hell. And bold as it might seem to say, I would suggest that these are actually distortions of the actual Buddhist scripture. And at times, I think very unintentionally at times, this is actually how it's presented in the West to make it more palatable to the Western audience. What we don't often hear of in the West, some of the fundamental tenets that I see within the actual Buddhist scripture themselves are, for example, the divine status of the Buddha, the necessity of faith and love and even worship of the Buddha, the existence of gods. This is about an ultimate reality in Buddhism. Basically, that there are many topics that we don't see often in the West in common culture that are actually within the Buddhist tradition itself. One of the things we have to do is to place Buddhism in its evolutionary context, to really look at it as part of the Indian religious tradition. Oftentimes, people will say, well, you have to look at Buddhism on its own terms, in its own evolutionary context, but what you end up, I have experienced, what you end up seeing is this culled version of Buddhism. So I would suggest that it truly is best to actually look at Buddhism within the Hindu, and especially Upanishadic context, to see what the Buddha is responding to, what he is correcting, what he is answering, and thereby be able to actually understand the Buddha's claim more clearly. One facet of how Buddhism can be portrayed at times, and again, especially within the West, is the claim that Buddhism is non-theistic. This is to me, a very peculiar claim. That Buddhism is a non-theistic, not atheistic, not theistic, but non-theistic, in the sense that it doesn't speak of divine beings. Why this is so strange is because if Buddhism is non-theistic, then I would have to say that Greek mythology is non-theistic, that Roman religion was non-theistic, Sumerian or Egyptian religions were non-theistic. Why? Because Roman, Sumerian, Egyptian, and Greek mythology, or Norse mythology for that matter, has many divine beings. And so does Buddhism. When we actually look within the Pali Canon, we encounter the divine beings that come out of the Hindu Vedic tradition, meaning the tradition that comes from the Vedas, the holy scriptures of Hinduism. So to place a phrase like non-theistic on Buddhism, if I'm going to be just and honest, I'm actually going to have to say, well, it's non-theistic because these people think that there's no ultimate divine one God. But then I would actually have to call Greek mythology and Egyptian mythology non-theistic. So I really do believe that placing this term on Buddhism is itself just a distortion of actually what Buddhism is saying. So at the very least, we would say that Buddhism is actually polytheistic, meaning it has many, many gods. Because in actual fact, as I think we will see, Buddhism has more gods than Greek mythology, more gods than Sumerian mythology. And in some sense, I would even suggest more divine beings than even Hinduism itself. And of course, we're looking at ultimate reality within Buddhism. And again, it may seem striking, but that we will be seeing that there is, I believe, a very clear conception of an ultimate within the Buddhist tradition. And we'll see what that looks like. So before going into some of the Buddhist scriptures themselves, I believe there's a series of philosophical problems with presenting Buddhism as a non-theistic or atheistic tradition. One of those things is sort of related to the Western conception of deism. The idea that, well, there might be an ultimate reality, but that ultimate reality is not concerned with human existence, is actually not an intervening being, not a being that relates to its creation in any direct way. More like, if you will, the grand architect or the mathematical being that is behind the laws of the universe and rationality. Why I find this untenable is because, first of all, just like the problem with deism itself, the question arises, well, is there a moral code? Are there virtues or qualities that we refer to as virtues that actually have to be manifested and, if you will, exemplified within a human life in order to ascend towards this being or to be of a greater fulfillment of our life? And I think the answer, both for the deists in the early modern philosophical era as well as within Buddhism, the answer is yes, that we're supposed to see people as ends, not as means. We're supposed to be just and honest and compassionate. We're supposed to seek truth and duty and responsibility and sacrifice for the good of all. All these are represented with Buddhism and within a lot of deistic writings. But all those things have to do with how we treat each other. All those things have to do with how we relate to each other as human beings so that we can be in accord or congruent with the reality that we're supposed to be, which means that the laws that we're looking at are directly related to human beings themselves. There are truths about human beings and how we should act within this world, and these derive from, if you will, deism, or in Buddhism, from the Dharma. So if we are in any way beholden to the teachings of virtue and sacrifice, then we have what I would call like an ontological ethic, something outside of us that we are actually beholden to, which seems to cause, I would suggest, very large philosophical problems for a complete absentee landlord conception of a, say, law-like or mathematical principle behind the universe. This is what I would call the problem of the Dharma itself. Another aspect that comes up with relationship to Buddhism is the concept of a bodhisattva. A bodhisattva, which does appear within the pages of the Pali Canon, is a being who, under the teachings of the Buddha, has ascended through a purification of themselves, of a disentanglement with this world, an embodying of the principles of compassion and non-attachment. They reach a place where they are able to actually pass into the realm of nirvana. They can finally leave the world of what's called samsara, the realm of birth and rebirth, of death and suffering, but they choose not to. And when they choose not to, they do so out of compassion for all other human beings. In fact, all living things. Their entire focus is actually to ensure that they stay within the realm of suffering and within the realm of trials in order to sacrifice themselves for the raising up of all beings and bringing them towards a true understanding of the Dharma. The Buddha himself does this. at the beginning of his mission, he is able immediately to pass into nirvana. But he actually stays for the sake of those who might see. So the question would be, I think, do the Bodhisattvas, who choose not to enter the realm of nirvana, but rather to stay in this world and sacrifice out of love and compassion, do this in accord with what the Dharma really says? And I think if we look at the Buddhist scriptures, we have to agree that they do. That the Buddha, when he actually chooses to actually remain in this world, although he can leave the realm of samsara, of aging, sickness, death, and trial and suffering, he chooses to stay in contrast to what Mara, this figure Mara, tells him to do, which is to release himself from suffering, because no one will listen. That Mara really is the figure of, if you will, Satan within the Buddhist writings, because Mara tempts the Buddha, telling him not to stay, not to follow his compassion, his sense of justice and love, but rather to either pass into nirvana, into death, in a sense, or to actually take money, wealth, and power. It's very much like the testing of Jesus by Satan in the wilderness.